2. African Dreams. Lady Galway. The thought nauseated her. Charlotte sat at her dressing table, her elbows forcing thick glass jars of face creams and delicately etched perfume bottles precariously close to the edge. She formed these silent, hated words a breath away from the mirror. Lady Galway. Perhaps if she could just get used to the notion, it wouldn't be so abhorrent. She adopted a haughty stare as her mouth tightened into a hard, unrepentant scowl. She looked refined, regal. She looked like her sister. She groaned. Inhaling the familiar scent of beeswax and rosewater, she smeared a dollop of oily crimson across her lower lip, then sat back, shaking off the languor. What was happening to her? Charlotte looked around the room at the familiar objects of her childhood, illuminated in the soft light of the brass gaselier that hung from the ceiling. She stared at the sputtering flames behind the pink glass chimney, remembering when they could barely afford candles. She was only 8 when all that had changed, and it had changed as suddenly as the Arctic winds in September, with the arrival of the mysterious soldier. "Uncle Reggie," he'd said, with laughing eyes as he tossed her into the air. However, he was not like any soldier she had ever seen, nor like any other man. Large and imposing, he had devoured the space around him. He had ridden up on a charger, so black that it seemed a creature from hell. Perhaps its rider was the devil himself. Swinging a heavy-booted leg over the military pommel, he had catapulted to the ground with a grandiose sweep, tossing back the most spectacular cape Charlotte had ever seen. Red and black stripes wound their way around his torso with the sensuous embrace of an oriental viper. But beneath the cape, Charlotte was startled to see that he wore no shirt, simply the short blue tunic casually unbuttoned to reveal burnished skin against gold military braid. She would never forget the flashing black eyes and that brilliant, unguarded smile through the ragged beard, nor the glittering dagger that hung loosely from his hips, a twisted silver flame. The entire household had rushed to greet him, led by her father, his face as white as a ghost. None but she had seen the fleeting glimpse of fear across his face before. It was replaced by his familiar smile of genial goodwill. They had poured out onto the lawn, an unkept grassy field of weeds and briars, and the two men embraced with the fervour of long-lost brothers. "Reginald, by my soul, I thought you were lost," her father exclaimed as he grasped the giant by his shoulders. "Not lost, found. I have found my fortune in the darkest reaches of the darkest continent. And you, cousin, shall too." His white teeth gleamed beneath the ragged beard, black eyes glittering like burning coals as he dragged her bewildered father up the steps of the manor house. "Yes, cousin, we are going to Africa." A shimmer ran down Charlotte's spine, and her hand closed softly on the small box that was her only reminder of that fateful journey. And what could you be thinking about? Charlotte jumped at the presence behind her, then turned to look up into the greenest eyes she had ever seen. An apparition in emerald stood behind her, jade eyes smiling mischievously into hers. Lydia! Lydia was a young woman hardly older than Fiona, but the comparison ended there, for she was more goddess than aristocrat. When she entered a room, every head would turn, and rightly so, for every movement, every gesture was calculated for maximum effect. She radiated breeding, wealth, and frank sexuality, and wore a gown as alluring as any spider's web. Charlotte threw her arms around her friend, Lady Lydia Ashford, a distant cousin. Lydia could directly credit her Amazonian proportions and chestnut hair to the best breeding the Earnshaw bloodlines could muster. And as was fitting to her station, she had been both married and widowed early. Now she was young, beautiful, and, above all, unattached. Charlotte envied her wildly. After the two embraced, Lydia sank into an overstuffed chair. Gingerly, she pulled an old doll from beneath her voluminous skin. "Shouldn't you be greeting your guests? Mrs. Giffens will certainly scold you if you play the mischief maker tonight. She'll have to catch me first." Charlotte's tart reply belied the beaming smile that radiated from her like a beacon. Collapsing at Lydia's feet, she wriggled happily like a puppy. "Oh, it's so good to see you. Where on earth have you been?" Her cousin tossed back her head with delicious contemplation as she settled into the soft cushions. "I have been looking for a husband, of course. I shall have you know that I have had at least a half-dozen marriage proposals, none of which I am taking seriously. How these bloodied English milksops bore me." Lydia leaned down and unceremoniously hitched up a handful of skirt and smoothed gossamer stockings. "I fear I shall never find this mating business an easy task." Charlotte gave a heartfelt sigh. "Oh, how I envy you and your freedom to be able to do what you please and go where you please. That must be the greatest joy one can imagine." Lydia scrutinized her cousin. "But no joy can compare to finding that special person. You have yours." Charlotte grabbed the doll from Lydia's lap with unexpected ferocity. "Mine indeed. I wish the saints to be delivered of him." Lydia arched an eyebrow. "And what does your sister think?" "Fiona? I care not a whit. She and Derek may have each other." A pealing hiccup of laughter escaped Lydia's lips. "Oh, how positively typical of you, my darling Charlotte. Now that you have captured the heart of the most dashing, the most charming, the most eligible bachelor in the county, you wish to throw him back into the water like some fish." "He is not suitable," Charlotte spluttered. "So then, who is?" Charlotte grasped for words, but none came as she peered intently into the doll's face. "It is certainly not Derek. Suitable is much more mature, gentle, caring." Lydia snorted. "Goodness, you are talking of your father. You are no child." "And why should I want to be a woman?" Charlotte huffed. "Oh yes, now if I were a man, that would be something different. Becoming a man means freedom, freedom to be whom I choose, freedom to go where I choose, freedom to wed or not wed whom I choose. Oh, yes, if I were a man, that would be something else entirely. Surely you must see that love is merely another master. No, no man shall have my love." "And what of Derek? Least of all Derek." Charlotte's voice was hard with resolution. Lydia arched a brow. "Then you have loved no one?" Charlotte's breath caught. She stilted the shiver in her hands, pressing them to her thighs. "Once, but he is gone. Gone forever." Lydia rose, the soft rustle of silk nearly masking her faint murmur as she stepped out into the beckoning glow of the stairway. "Then, if I were you, I should find him." A string of oaths filled the air in thick, icy puffs of steam. The heavy diamond-shaped ivy on the massive granite walls seemed to tremble beneath the verbal onslaught of the oriental tongue. He stood at the foot of Highgate Manor. Before him rose an ancient gateway with an elaborate heraldic ornament. Only briefly did he pause to study the medieval pattern, his jaw clenching involuntarily at its sudden familiarity. He almost had to laugh at his own gut-twisting response before he filled his lungs with the damp salt air. It was still tinged with the sea. An ancient lodge with curling chimney stacks stood immediately within view, the gatekeeper distracted by the heavy and chaotic traffic of carriages and footmen, all bathed in the glow from the estate house as they set out across the magnificent lawn. A mile beyond was the imposing mass of the great grey house. He had waited so long. He lifted a thick-booted sole to the stone and threaded a gloved hand through the ivy. With a massive jerk he began to climb, and like a hound of hell he entered the gates of Hades. Mrs. Given's shriek was enough to drive any corpse from its grave. Every fibre in Charlotte's body jolted to full attention as she turned to see Mrs. Given's face contorted in outrage. Her plump cheeks reddened like polished winesaps. As she pointed an accusing finger, "Ye gods, what are you doing to that fine gown, young miss? On your feet this instant!" Charlotte clambered up, but not before her small breasts nearly spilled fully out of her bodice. Clumsily trying to push them back down into her unyielded corset, she was having precious little success. To make matters worse, the French heel of her satin slipper was caught in the intricate lacework of her petticoat, trampling the pristine hem of her gown. She could feel the sliding weight of her hair escaping through the combs, trickling like water through a sieve. She was falling to pieces. Mrs. Givens balefully shook her head and pulled her charge before the mirror one last time as she adjusted the bodice and smoothed heavy satin folds into place. With the concentration of a surgeon, she lovingly worked her magic, fingers as swift as a young girl's as she wound loops of hair back into place. Finally, she stood back and practically purred with satisfaction. "You're a sight, you are. You're the spitting image of your dear mother, God rest her soul." Charlotte turned back to see Mrs. Givens dab at her eyes with the edge of her apron, before daintily blowing her nose. "Am I truly Mrs. Givens? Papa said she was beautiful." Mrs. Givens matter-of-factly shooed away Charlotte's hand from a curl. "Ye more so, which is the worse for ye. It never bodes well for a lass to be too comely. Now you've got your own cross to bear." As Charlotte cocked her head quizzically, Mrs. Givens patted her cheek with forced cheer. "Just listen to me prattle. Now out you go this instant. You've been dawdling long enough. This is your ball, your engagement. 'Tis time to play the lady." With an affectionate shove, Mrs. Givens pushed Charlotte out the door. Halfway down the hall, Charlotte glanced back and saw the old woman touch the tiny gold cross tucked into the deep folds of her bosom and cross herself. Though she tried her best to blot out the image, Charlotte could not stop the chills that relentlessly chased up her spine. Charlotte tenderly fingered the pearl nestled at the small of her throat. Wearing it, she could not help but think of her mother. Tonight she would have been so proud. She stopped at the top of the massive stairway and forlornly looked down at her gown. It seemed at that moment she inhabited a stranger's body, someone too elegant, too pretty, too womanly. She tugged at the plunging neckline of her bodice, but it stubbornly held its place. She groaned. With each second it seemed that her world was being stripped away. Only her alert violet blue eyes remained hers alone, hers and her mother's. The faint strains of a waltz beckoned. Lush chords filled the air like a cloying perfume, and in the centre of the grand ballroom swirled the first revellers. Flashing silk and lace intermingled with the masculine stamp of black twill and military crimson. Yes, this is what she needed. Charlotte could feel the heat rise in her cheeks in anticipation. She was born to dance, and betrothal or no betrothal, she would dance the night away. Her hands plucked the cool ivory satin of her skirt, and she swept toward the siren song of Vienna. Looking down from the balcony, Lord Earnshaw frowned at the antics of his daughter. What a wild creature he had spawned. How unlike her mother she was now, impetuous, willful, demanding, and with an infuriating mind of her own. Where had she gotten such a nature? Like quicksilver it was. One minute she could be a little harridan, thrashing the local boys for cruelly using their ponies. The next she was like a fairy flitting about, creating some mischief for poor Mrs. Givens. And then sometimes she could be an angel incarnate, sweetly cajoling him for some trinket. Earnshaw smiled ruefully to himself. Yes, when she leaves, he would miss her like life itself. A slight mist clouded his glasses, and he removed them, wiping his eyes with a linen handkerchief, convincing himself that the draughty airs tickled his nose. He must not think of such sentimental claptrap. Not now. He could feel the letter burning in his waistcoat pocket. How could such a small slip of paper threaten the world that he held so dear? He had already bought his safety at the most dreadful cost possible, and yet, once again, the spectre of his past threatened to destroy everything. Watching Charlotte, Earnshaw vowed that it would not be in vain. He would save Highgate. Flushed from dancing and escaping the addled attentions of the fourth in a string of eager dance partners, Charlotte darted from the ballroom floor into the milling crowd of familiar faces, straightening a puff sleeve that slipped precariously from her shoulder. She was quickly tiring of her new abundance of admirers. Pimple-faced sons of gentry, arrogant young officers fresh from India, and stuffy elder merchants in search of a young and titled bride. Her only consolation was the fact that Derek had yet to arrive. Charlotte began to twist a stray tendril of hair, escaping a comb tucked beneath her ear. Her eyes scanned the expansive ballroom filled with the cream of English society. They were here because of her, she suddenly remembered. Something which made her catch her breath. The thought of marriage translated directly to her fingers, and she tugged feverishly at the golden lock until it seemed to cut off the circulation to her scalp. How had she allowed herself to get into such a predicament? She had once been fond of Derek, and yes, even a bit attracted to him. But what girl wouldn't be? He was handsome, there was no doubt of that. When he had courted Fiona, Charlotte had secretly watched them as they walked through the manicured gardens or rode to the hunt. What woman wouldn't notice the pale, tousled hair, almost white in the sunlight, or how well he filled out his riding hack, his broad shoulders straining against the heavy serge? Fiona used to tease him playfully that he intimidated others, because he too closely resembled a Greek god. But Charlotte knew that the comparison was uncannily accurate. From his high rounded forehead and chiselled straight nose down to his elegant jaw, carved as if from marble, Derek emanated a mesmerizing combination of refinement and menace, tinged with the arrogance she recognized so well in the family of Galway. Yes, Charlotte thought grimly, Derek was a patrician through and through. But marry him? That was something else entirely. She anxiously scanned the room, afraid of spying the familiar blonde head. It would be towering over the rest, for Derek was formidable in his stature as well as demeanour, and she had seen many a potential foe back away in greater wisdom when encountering Derek's sudden and unpredictable wrath. Then the cool grey of his eyes would glitter with the strange intensity of the coldest honed steel. Charlotte froze at the thought of those eyes piercing her, possessing her, and a chill swept through her at the thought. "Charlotte, there you are!" boomed a voice as a strong male hand clamped heavily on her bare arm. Charlotte twisted around to face her attacker, her eyes wide. She was practically nose to nose with the stoop-shouldered Earl of Wellesley, a kindly man who vaguely reminded Charlotte of an orangutan dressed in a starched collar. She let out a deep breath of relief as she lifted a long and hairy finger to the side of his nose, in mock contemplation. "And what do we have here? Would it be our own Miss Earnshaw? Apparently not, for the Miss Earnshaw that I am acquainted with would certainly have a bright smile on her fair countenance, particularly on the night of her betrothal." "Perhaps not, your lordship, because marriage is an institution I am beginning to find overrated." Lord Wellesley laughed with a high, croaking wheeze, amused by the characteristic audacity of the young woman on his arm. "Then I must deliver you to your father, I dare say, for you prove dangerous when left to your own devices. He has been too indulgent, I fear, and allowed your charming head to be filled with modern nonsense." "But why is it nonsense to be the mistress of my own destiny? To live alone, free of society's restrictions? You do." Lord Wellesley's face reddened. "I am a very poor paragon, my dear. I am independent, yes, but a life spent alone is most likely a difficult one. Not a fate to bestow on such a lovely young lady." Charlotte opened her mouth to protest, but Lord Wellesley patted her hand. "Ah, here is your father now, and not alone, I see." Charlotte was all too familiar with the company her father kept. Well respected as a scholar, Lord Earnshaw had the uncanny knack for attracting the most bizarre assortment of adventures. He loved to surround himself with soldiers and scholastics alike, listening raptly to their new exploits abroad, particularly Africa, for Africa was his true passion. She watched his greying head bob, owlish flames dancing on his nose in animated conversation, surrounded by his court of military men and squires. His cheeks were flushed, the only Earnshaw trait that he and Charlotte shared, a trait that revealed their emotions as readily as any barometer. Charlotte recognized all the familiar signs. No doubt he was caught up in some tall tale. A scholar devoted to the study of man, Earnshaw was a true scientist, ruthless in his pursuit of knowledge to the exclusion of all else. He had been the follower of the famous Dr. Livingstone, and Charlotte could clearly remember the day he had announced that they and her Uncle Reggie would join the exploration party to find none other than the source of the Nile. But he returned a broken man, never travelling again. Still, his youngest daughter suspected his heart remained in Africa, or at least some part of his soul, for he could never stop talking about it, studying, fretting over the latest news from some traveller fresh from the dark continent. Charlotte recalled one incident with a shudder. One balmy evening, unable to sleep, she had wandered through the mansion's dark hallways and spied a light from her father's study. Gladdened for some company, she had softly opened the door and peered in, breathing in the familiar musty air of the library. This was her father's favourite refuge from the world, and she would often find him there, poring over some ancient tome for hours, his glasses drooping precariously on the tip of his nose. But that night was different. His back was to her, a faded velvet robe slipping down his arms, a rumpled nightcap covering his balding pate. She saw his frail shoulders hunched over the massive cherrywood desk, seated in his all-too-familiar slump. But even in the dimly lit room, she could feel his agitation, see the pallor of his pinched features as his fingers traced and retraced once again the huge map unfurled before him, a veined parchment cipher of ornate Latin scrawl. Beneath these unreadable letters lay the mysterious unknown, reduced to the calculated formulations of water and land. Charlotte would never forget his voice, hoarse, terrified, rising and falling in dark cadence, almost an incantation. "So far away, but I hear you. I hear you calling me to hell, but I won't go. I won't. An icy chill pricked her skin, sweeping with a sickening rush through her body. She knew she was a witness to madness. Charlotte ran from her father's study, ran from the map of Africa and its dark power. She had always seen her father as strong-minded, a man of rational thought, and now he raved over a roll of parchment. Reaching her room, she pulled the heavy door shut behind her, closing on the ghastly vision. But she could never forget the terrible look etched on his face, and it had haunted her in the weeks to come. Perhaps one day he would tell her, explain the madness, but she would never forget the terror in his eyes. Now she saw him smiling as he spied her, warmed with the heat of mulled wine and lively conversation. Escaping the clutch of his companions, Earnshaw charged forward with eager enthusiasm. "There you are, my dear. You must meet my distinguished guest, Colonel Basil Musgrave. He has news of Africa." Charlotte's heart sank. Africa. She hated the word now, and yet her father was as giddy as a schoolboy as he dragged her from Lord Wellesley's grasp and into the noisy debate. Charlotte recognised the familiar crimson uniform of Her Majesty's service looming directly in front of her. The man was certainly a formidable character, ramrod straight in one of the most beautiful uniforms created, all epaulettes and braid, brass buttons and a chest full of medals. He twisted a drooping silver moustache as he regaled a stout Anglican priest with tales of battle. Earnshaw's nervous cough drew the colonel's attention. He fixed his gaze on Charlotte, imperiously smoothing his moustache. "1,000 pardons, my dear young lady. I fear the talk of war gets my blood boiling. Not fit for a female of breeding." Charlotte laughed, brushing away the bombastic words with a wave of her hand. "Please continue, sir. We Earnshaws pride ourselves in being plain-spoken, and I've heard many a story of war. So, are we quarrelling with the Germans now?" The colonel snorted in indignation. "It's a shame. Bloody shame. Less than a year ago, thanks to the wisdom of our good Queen, East Africa was destined to be our fairest jewel. We had finally subdued the savages and looked forward to peace and prosperity for all." Except, of course, for the savages. Charlotte could not resist the jibe, but the colonel merely acknowledged her interjection with a scowl. "Before they could ruin it, my dear," he corrected sharply. He turned back to Earnshaw with a brandish of a braided sleeve. "Everything was calm, the coast guarded by none other than the Sultan of that fair island, Zanzibar, and sheltering him, the protective arm of the British Empire." The colonel's voice resonated with satisfied authority before he paused for full dramatic effect. The next moment, the bloody Germans were there, claiming all the mainland before Zanzibar as theirs. To add further insult, they held a dozen so-called treaties with those savage chiefs, flaunting their rebellion in our faces. The colonel raised a threatening fist as people shrank back. "It's enough to put you off colonization altogether." The priest sniffed sympathetically. As the colonel thundered on, Charlotte's mind floated elsewhere. Zanzibar. Images once pushed to the recesses of her mind now came flooding back with a shocking intensity. She closed her eyes to clear her mind, to force the unwanted visions back. But what of Zanzibar? She heard herself ask. "Of course, Zanzibar will remain British. We've put too much into her to let her go now to that bunch of hooligans. She's still the finest port in Africa. Let the bloody Germans have Dar es Salaam or Mombasa, but Zanzibar, nah." The priest nervously cleared his throat. "But isn't there still that little exporting problem?" The colonel looked at him blankly, and then his face lit up in open, jovial recognition. "Oh, you mean slaves? No problem with that, my good man. We have the Sultan well in hand and have his word that they have desisted in that barbaric custom." "But I hear from good authority the priest persisted, that there is still a considerable black market that deals in human cargo. The priest's voice awkwardly trailed into a whisper. Rubbish, the colonel retorted with a dismissive wave of hand. Sheer rubbish. And besides, we're just talking about bloody savages. It's not as if they're enslaving Englishmen. The colonel's face was well-groomed and meticulous. His eyes glowed with a fiery zeal, and yet what lay behind him was something cold and dead. Charlotte hated him. Pardon me, sir, but I thought we were speaking of human beings, not animals. She foisted off her father's hand as she pushed her face up to the colonel's. I can think of no fate more terrible than depriving a human being of his freedom, for what can be more precious than a human life, whether or not it be British? Indeed, I would like to see how you would feel if it happened to you. But, my dear, the priest interrupted with a strangled, piping voice, people must accept inequality as a necessary part of life. Just look at we English. On the whole, we admire those that rule our sovereign state. We must have a ruling class. Charlotte straightened to full height. Then God save me from the British and all its ruling classes. The colonel's ruddy face registered utter astonishment at Charlotte's furious attack. Before he could respond, he was interrupted by a burst of hearty laughter. All heads turned in the direction of the figure behind him. The man radiated elegance, the deep indigo of his velvet evening coat, a stark contrast to the blonde hair shimmering like warm silver in the intense light of the chandeliers. His studied slouch thrust a hip forward, one hand resting lightly on his satin waistcoat. He was obviously amused, his lips pursed. Charlotte recognized the familiar grey eyes. Derek, she sighed. The name seemed to hang suspended in the air like some dark bird of prey. Derek moved forward with an easy grace, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's. How now, my dear Charlotte? I have been searching in vain for you all evening, and now I find my beloved surrounded by men and in an uproar over freedom. 'Tis not a seemly subject for a woman, though I must confess it brings a sweet glow to your cheeks. Charlotte stiffened at the hint of sarcasm in his voice. If caring for the plight of my fellow man requires a cause, then I have no choice. It is my duty. Duty? Derek smirked, his gaze unwavering, a glimpse of teeth behind the smile. There are many aspects of duty, one of which we celebrate tonight. I refer to marriage, of course. Duty, is that how you see marriage? Why, that most certainly brings us full circle to slavery, does it not? Charlotte felt the blood rise to her cheeks. Dare you make such a comparison? The smile had faded from Derek's mouth, replaced by a grim set of the jaw. The tension was palpable, as everyone stood transfixed. You have made the comparison, not I. Charlotte's eyes blazed, her voice calm, masking the tug of anger and fear. She only had to look at Derek to see she had hit her mark. Every muscle in his body was coiled tightly, ready to lash out, and she knew she was the target. There you are, dear Charlotte. A feminine voice trilled. Through the dense crowd bustled her sister, Fiona, hair bobbing in a profusion of ringlets. As she elbowed her way past the colonel, she coquettishly kissed her father, then turned her full focus on Derek. Her face assumed a childlike pout. Oh, have I interrupted something? Charlotte felt a mixture of relief and despair as she watched Fiona thrust her bosom closer to Derek. Only a man could do this to her sister. Only a man could turn her into such an unabashed tart. No, not at all, sister. I was just leaving, she said flatly, avoiding Derek's glare. She could still feel his eyes following her as she gathered her skirt with a flourish. Good evening, gentlemen. She fled into the crowd, darting through the barrage of merrymakers, looking for escape, seeking refuge in a darkened hall. Suddenly, the iron grip of fingers closed like a vice on her shoulders, jerked violently back. She was thrown against a wall. She looked up into a shadowed face, contorted and ugly. Derek tightened his fingers, breathless with rage. "You're hurting me," she struggled to escape as he held firm. "How dare you dismiss me like some common servant?" His voice pushed through his teeth in an angry hiss. Charlotte futilely twisted in his iron grip. "Better I should have dismissed you as a bridegroom." Stung, Derek tightened his grip, his livid face pressing down to hers in a snarl. "You should be grateful I've consented to marry you. Believe me, my own sweet darling, if it weren't for your sizable dowry, you'd never find a man fool enough to wed such a shrew, not to mention a bastard." Charlotte briefly closed her eyes, but she forced her gaze back. "I prefer to be a bastard than be at the mercy of a tyrant." The quiver in her voice belied her icy calm. "And break your father's heart," Derek sneered, pushing away from her. "No, we shall marry, my own dear heart, and you shall be my obedient wife, for it is your father's wish." Derek's grimace began to contort into what Charlotte knew would be a malicious smile, but she was already running from the room.